Looks like we're gonna go ahead and get started. My name is Jillian Gordner. I am the Make Polluters Pay Campaign Associate with the U.S. Public Interest Research Group. And thank you all so much for joining us today to celebrate the reinstatement of the polluter pays tax on chemicals and to discuss the future of the Superfund Toxic Waste Cleanup Program. I'm joined today by United States Representative Earl Blumenauer of Oregon, Cassie Cohen and Mammalia from the Portland Harbour Community Coalition, Ed Lorenz, activist with the Pine River Community Advisory Group and a professor at Alma College, Marcus Griswold, founder and director of the Calm Waters Group, and Jim Wolford, member of the Environmental Protection Network and former director of the Office of Superfund Remediation and Technology Innovation at EPA. So first, we'll hear from each of the speakers as they address different pieces of the Superfund program, including the challenges facing individual sites, the impact of increased funding, and what policies are still needed to improve the program. Then we'll take any questions at the end. For those of you that are on the webinar, you can put your questions in the chat. And if you've called in, you can text your question to 570-468-3911. First, I'm going to give a little background on the Superfund program. Superfund is a toxic waste cleanup program enacted by Congress in 1980 to give the EPA the authority and the funds to identify polluters and hold them responsible for cleaning up their toxic waste. When they can't find the polluters or the responsible party can't pay, this program gave the EPA the authority and funds then to do that cleanup themselves. Today, there are more than 1,300 of these sites managed by the Superfund program that are on the national priorities list. And the chemicals at these sites are many of the most dangerous chemicals that we know, such as mercury, asbestos, arsenic, lead, and others, which are linked to cancer, heart and respiratory diseases, neurological deficits, birth defects, and other serious illnesses. So when the program started, it was funded by polluter pays taxes on hazardous chemicals and crude oil. A little later, a third corporate environmental tax was added. And all three of these were intended to ensure a steady source of funding for the Superfund program and to hold the polluting industries financially accountable for the cleanup of toxic waste rather than the individual taxpayer. But in 1995, all three of these taxes lapsed. And as you can see on this chart, through the 90s, when there was still funding from the polluter pays taxes, the EPA was able to conduct far more cleanup actions each year. So for reference, construction completion is a milestone indicating that all physical cleanup required at a site has been completed. So once that funding dried up around 2000, the construction completions dropped dramatically and continuously till today. Whereas in the 90s, we saw 60, 70, 80 sites being cleaned up each year. In 2021, there were 8. And this is one of the reasons that we launched our Make Polluters Pay campaign, to get back this funding and to hold polluting industries, not individual Americans, financially responsible. Another motivating factor for launching the Make Polluters Pay campaign is the increasing concern about climate-induced natural disasters, which threaten to burn, flood, or otherwise damage Superfund sites and spread contamination into nearby communities. In 2019, the Government Accountability Office came out with a report showing that 60% of Superfund sites are in areas at risk from climate change. This includes storm surge, sea level rise, and wildfires. In 2020, the Union of Concerned Scientists reported that more than 800 Superfund sites are at risk of flooding in the next 20 years under even a moderate sea level rise scenario. And last year, US PIRG and Environment America released a report that nearly half of all Superfund national priorities list sites were in areas affected by hurricane force winds or severe weather during the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. Given this dire news, though, the great news is that at the end of last year, Congress reinstated the polluter pays tax on 42 hazardous chemicals to fund the Superfund program. After more than 2 decades of chronic underfunding for the program, this represents a new opportunity to address the worst toxic waste sites in the United States, many of which have been undergoing slow and stalling cleanup for years or decades. The law is expected to generate $1 billion in revenue for the program next year alone. And the infrastructure bill also provided $3.5 billion to the Superfund program, $1 billion of which has already been distributed across 49 sites. This is a huge victory because the bipartisan support for the infrastructure law shows that protecting communities from toxic waste is a common sense idea that transcends party lines. So many committed individuals, organizations, and Congress members who worked on this effort, and you'll hear from many of these today. We'd like to take some time to recognize and thank one of the key champions, Representative Blumenauer of Oregon. Representative Blumenauer has long fought for policies that protect people from toxic waste. He became the U.S. representative for Oregon's 3rd District in 1996 and is currently a member of the Ways and Means Committee, chairman of the Subcommittee on Trade, and a member of the Subcommittee on Health. For years, Representative Blumenauer has sponsored and co-sponsored legislation to reinstate the polluter pays taxes. He worked with his colleagues to ensure its inclusion in the infrastructure law, and he supported the Portland Harbour Community Coalition's efforts to secure a full cleanup of the Portland Harbour Superfund site. Representative Blumenauer continues to support efforts to protect Oregonians and all Americans from hazardous chemicals, most recently introducing legislation to strengthen the federal emergency management agency's approach to climate disasters. Representative Blumenauer, thank you so much for your past and continuing work on this issue. I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jillian. I appreciate the PIRG organizing this webinar about the importance of the polluter pays concept. This is something that has just been a huge priority for me. I came to Congress right after, unfortunately, the Republican majority refused to consider extending the expired provisions in 1995. And throughout that period of time, they refused to be able to move it forward. That shifted the burden to the general fund, the general taxpayers, and also more of a burden on other adjacent property owners. When we deal with these Superfund sites that go back in many cases decades in the past, and oftentimes there isn't a party to hold responsible, not having the Superfund resources available drags out the cleanup. And we have Mr. Wolford on the call here who could probably cite chapter and verse of the amazing challenges there are to put together the programs to affect the cleanup. And without the resources of the Superfund, it makes those discussions all the more contentious. It slows down the process, and it shifts in many respects to the general taxpayer to pick up the tab for what the petrochemical industry created. Originally, back in the original legislation in 1980, it was a perfect symmetry where the taxes were levied against the people who created the problem. And it was a relatively modest tax spread throughout the petrochemical industry. So it wasn't unduly burdensome. And these are the people who profited from it. And many of whom, had they been able to be held responsible, would be paying. But given the complexity of the Superfund process, and as I mentioned, some cases not being able to identify responsible parties, or they're no longer in business, it stretched it out. It put the burden on people who shouldn't have had to do that. And it's created challenges like what we face with the Portland Harbor. This has been a priority for me since I came to Congress. And I was pleased that we finally got my legislation enacted and that the Biden administration established a significant down payment, as was referenced by Jillian, getting billions of dollars in this process and then starting to replenish the fund. This is going to pay dividends for years to come, but it can't come any too soon. I appreciate the material here talking about the greater risk that we face because of climate change and extreme weather events, flooding in particular. It's going to make the cleanup more fraught, more expensive, and more dangerous to our communities. And as I think all of us know, these facilities, Superfund facilities, are disproportionately in low income, where people of color are likely to reside. So they bear the burden of that horrific condition. I am pleased that we're starting to rebuild the Superfund. I am pleased that we've got this down payment from the Biden administration. And I think this is going to help build the momentum that is so necessary. But it can't happen soon enough, because even with these resources, we have a challenge that is going to take years and years for us to be able to appropriately address. I appreciate it, being able to be on the webinar here. I appreciate the distinguished people that are going to be speaking. And I appreciate the PERG continuing the focus on making sure polluters pay. We'll have some legislation to augment what we've already passed to be able to extend the principle further to other polluters. But we've got momentum on our side. We've got some significant money as a down payment. And hopefully we have more public awareness of this opportunity. And I appreciate your putting the focus on this as we seek to build public awareness and develop the sense of urgency that's going to be necessary to solve this problem.
Thank you so much, Representative Blumenauer. Well said. Up next, we have Cassie Cohen and Mammalia. I'll first introduce Cassie. She is the executive director for the Portland Harbour Community Coalition. Cassie grew up in the Portland metro area, brings over 15 years of experience working in nonprofit, education, and the public sector to her current role. From 2019 to 2015, she led Groundwork Portland, an environmental justice organization led by and serving communities of color, during which time they formed the Portland Harbour Community Coalition. Mammalia is the communications director for the Portland Harbour Community Coalition. She's a recent graduate of the Lewis and Clark Environmental Studies program, interested in expanding accessibility of information about the Portland Harbour Superfund site and its cleanup, as well as other issues along the Willamette River. And I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Mammalia, I believe. I'm going to ask if Rachel can help allow Mammalia to share her screen. I am not tech savvy.
Thank you, Jillian. You should be good to share now. Thank you to Rachel. Before I start, I just want to make sure that everybody can see my screen. Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mammalia. I use she, her pronouns. And as Jillian introduced, I am working with the Portland Harbour Community Coalition. Firstly, on behalf of our coalition, I would like to thank Representative Blumenauer for leading and supporting the polluter pays tax in the recent infrastructure bill to help rebalance the scales and lessen the burden of cleanups on communities and taxpayers. I'd also like to thank US PERG for giving us the opportunity to speak today. The Portland Harbour Community Coalition was founded in 2012. Our mission is to elevate the voices of communities most impacted by pollution in the Portland Harbour Superfund site and ensure that impacted communities benefit from and lead the cleanup, restoration, and redevelopment of the harbour. Our coalition includes individuals and organizations representing frontline communities, including Native American and Indigenous communities, Black and African Americans, immigrants, refugees, people experiencing houselessness, and current residents living, working, subsisting, or recreating around the Portland Harbour Superfund site. The Portland metro area rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas bands of Chinook, Tualatin Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia and Willamette rivers, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and trade the natural resources. The Portland Harbour Superfund site is a 10-mile stretch of the Willamette River contaminated with dozens of chemicals. For example, PCBs, PAHs, and DDT. Cleanup will take decades and some contamination will be in place thereafter. The harbour is also an important economic centre in the region, being an international port of commerce with dozens of industries, including fuel storage and concrete processing, which are both major contributors to climate change. Nearby communities are some of the most vulnerable to pollution, yet often are not given a choice. This stretch of the river is important for recreation, salmon migration, resident species, housing, and is culturally important to a number of tribes. As Gillian mentioned earlier, the Government Accountability Office reported that 60% of Superfund sites are at risk from future flooding, wildfires, and also sea level rise. And as Representative Blumenauer mentioned, 2 million people in low-income communities live near Superfund sites. Many of these sites, like brownfield sites, will be reused in some form. Contamination and climate change pose risks to human and ecosystem health. Key risks specific to the Portland Harbour Superfund site include the impacts of projected rising air and water temperatures, more intense flooding and changes in snowpack, wildfires, and earthquakes, all of which could be disastrous for the health and safety of the community and the survival of fisheries. It's critical to include Superfund frontline communities in future plans for resilience.
And I'll just quickly introduce myself again, Cassie Cohen with Portland Harbour Community Coalition. I will follow up with what Mammalia shared already to continue the conversation about cleanup standards at Superfund sites. And I guess from our experience with Portland Harbour Superfund and also in communication with our neighbors up north with the Duwamish River Superfund site, we continue to feel the ongoing risks or threats of reduction of records of decisions or the influence of responsible parties and their powerful lobbying efforts to try to reduce cleanup levels or delay cleanups or minimize record of decisions. We also see this coming up around even sort of neighboring sites that might also be brownfields but not designated as Superfunds, and how sometimes distinctions between cleanup levels can also bleed into the Superfund and reducing Superfund levels of cleanup. And so we would love to see, future policy at the national level that can address these ongoing sort of risks to the effectiveness of Superfund cleanup. We're really grateful for the reinstatement of the Superfund tax, and then we'd like to think what more can we do to ensure the effectiveness and efficiency and sort of to ensure justice around cleanup of Superfund in the long term. We also like to kind of encourage and think about how EPA can increase their capacity to conduct, for example, more robust sampling and comprehensive sampling for remedial action. We've felt here, even with one of our areas within the Portland Harbor that where EPA is leading on Cathedral Park, which is a primary access, recreational access site to the river, which is our Superfund, that they have been limited in how comprehensive they can be around sampling. And so we hope that EPA is able to expand their reach and to involve community in those phases as well. EPA needs more funding to hire climate experts, environmental justice experts, Superfund jobs training experts, all to be able to intersect with the Superfund programs throughout the EPA regions across the nation, and to be able to ensure that there are high standards around implementation of what EPA touts as these values around environmental justice and public involvement in Superfund. EJ communities and tribes that are impacted by Superfunds need more direct, flexible, long-term funding resources through EPA to engage in Superfund sites throughout the duration of the life of the Superfund, even into the monitoring phases, because we know that this is sort of the expectation that EPA has, but when we don't have the resources, ongoing resources to participate, it makes it extremely challenging. So we hope to see, support even potentially from Representative Blumenauer's office and having the community be involved in, for example, how do we think about climate resiliency and how it intersects with Portland Harbor Superfund and other sites. We also are aware of how the public is still burdened. Although the burden has been lifted for communities to cover liability of orphan Superfund sites around the nation, there are, taxpayers and ratepayers that are still extremely burdened by having to pay Superfund liability for public agency responsible parties. So here in Portland, one example is in the city of Portland, the city charges every Portland resident, no matter what income level they have, the same as commercial entities, no matter whether commercial entities are a responsible party or a large corporation or, for example, a small minority-owned business. So, we feel that this is an unjust solution to addressing Superfund and requires more investigation and policy solutions at a national scale.
So one of the things that we're trying to do in our efforts in the context of the Portland Harbor Superfund site is to secure additional community benefit tools, which have been utilized for Superfund development, but not yet for the Superfund remedial design or action. PHCC proposes to pilot coordinated community benefits agreements for Portland Harbor Superfund site to ensure that communities impacted in the region by the Superfund are able to be part of the solution. A community benefits agreement would include high road standards for equitable contracting and workforce development, opportunities for diverse communities. It could also include a meaningful opportunity for the community to problem solve and provide oversight to ensure that the Superfund cleanup is implemented with as much quality and efficiency, and to uphold health and environmental standards.
So we would like to invite you to support the community priorities that we've shared today, whether you are an elected official or if you if you can consider advancing more equitable Superfund related policies, or whether you're a funder or a technical person that works in Superfund or a fellow Superfund affected community leader, to all kind of unite around centering the healing of Superfund communities and their respective sites, whether they're in the water or on land or air pollution. So we're grateful to have been invited today. Thank you so much. And we encourage folks to get in touch with us. We look forward to hearing from everyone.
Thank you both so much, Cassie and Mammalia. That was so great to hear. And we'll also have their emails at the end of the webinar as well. Reach out to them. I'm going to share my screen. Next, we have Dr. Ed Lorenz, who is a professor at Alma College and the vice chair of the Pine River Superfund Citizen Task Force and the US EPA Community Advisory Group. He's written several published items, all growing from regional environmental health issues, and was co-author of a study of DDT, the Pine River Statement, Human Health Consequences of DDT Use. After receiving his bachelor's degree in history and political science at Towson College, Dr. Lorenz went on to get a master's in history at Georgetown and a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. And I will leave it to you. Do you need to unmute it still? Ed, you're muted.
Okay.
All good.
Is that working?
Yep. Thank you.
And the screen is working, I take it. Yeah, just real briefly where I'm from. I'm from the middle of Michigan, from a little place called St. Louis, Michigan, not Missouri. And we have a set of 3 Superfund sites in the community of about 4,000 people as a result of the chemical plants operation that you can see on that photo. The river that goes through town is a tributary of the Lake Huron. So our contaminants, impact something much further down. There's a little map where we are, right in the middle of Michigan, along that river. Okay, there's a lot of books on us. Okay, so we're not an obscure site. If you get interested in this, I encourage you to look at those. Real briefly, though, what I wanted to focus on today is just one little component of that, but a very important component of it. And it's what made our site sort of infamous. And that is, we had a fundamental human health problem grow out of the contamination, not just the fact that people were being exposed to something linked to human health consequences, but we actually put the contaminants, someone else did, our polluter, into the bodies of human beings. And they did that through poor management of the chemical plant. They made a flame retardant composed of something called polybrominated biphenyls, or the acronym is PBB. And they also made an animal feed supplement, and through careless management, they shipped tons of the flame retardant in place of an animal feed supplement to an animal feed supply facility. The result of that was animals consumed it. And since no one knew the accident had taken place for over a year, people consumed products from farms. The result of this is something that sort of became famous in the 1970s, only because it was so sort of memorable, was the destruction of cattle. Shooting cattle actually started this. And here they're disposing of cow bodies. It ended up, this contaminated feed got all over, especially the lower peninsula of Michigan, generally the upper Midwest. Over 30,000 cattle had to be slaughtered, over 1.5 million chickens, pigs, lambs, all this. So we had major contamination. Obviously, people were really mad at this. When they found out they had been contaminated, the company was sued. There's a whole book on just their lawsuits. They struck a deal with EPA and the state. If they left town, basically, and demolished the plant on site and buried it, they'd be freed of liability. So they did this, and just as they were doing this is when Superfund came into effect. So we ended up getting 3 of the first Superfund sites. The old plant site, shown here along that river, which here is black, a county landfill south of town, and another area where they disposed of the contaminants. So we got 3 Superfund sites, and the company claimed they were going to clean it up, but they didn't do a good job. And in 1999, EPA came back into town, first with an emergency cleanup, and then with a longer term remediation of contaminated river sediment. So this is a massive construction project. It went on for 7 years, and in that time period, they removed 750,000 tons of contaminated river sediment, just a massive amount of work. So in many ways, we're happy with EPA. We've gotten a lot of money out of EPA, even when we didn't have much in the trust fund. Currently, we have an ongoing process of vaporizing contaminants buried below the cap over the old plant site. Though now that we have the Superfund tax renewed, and we're really happy about the renewal of the Superfund tax, we're getting a lot faster work on the site, but we've been getting a lot of site work before that. But our concern that I wanted to bring up today is related to human health. Okay, the contaminants that the company made, we knew were a threat to human health long before anything was done to regulate them. These are just 2 copies of peer-reviewed studies from the 40s of what they were doing. And even after we found out they made this mistake with cattle feed, action wasn't taken immediately. We wanted to preserve the jobs in the region and this sort of thing. And 8 million people, it ended up consumed, at least some polybrominated biphenyls. Farmers ended up losing markets, their herds slaughtered, workers were impacted. Eventually the company shut down, so they lost their jobs and all this. But nothing particularly was done about the human health consequences. And we know the PBB is at least correlated with very serious human health problems. Everything from, there's an endocrine disruptor. A lot of you know what I'm getting at with that. It impacts the reproductive system, apparently. Babies are born with, urinary genital system, problems. It seems like women have a lot of miscarriages who are exposed to this. So anyway, so there are a lot of health problems. And we kept being told, don't worry about it. We're taking care of that. We're cleaning up the contaminants. And every time we'd sort of hear that, there would be more urgent needs, like digging up the yards around homes, 90 homes in town in 2013, 14, 15. We had birds dying from consumption of the contaminants that we heard weren't there. The city got a whole new water system, as a result of this. And, we're really pleased, again, with the Superfund tax being renewed. We're really pleased with all the money we get for Superfund cleanups. But there's this human health component that is largely ignored. And we know that, most Superfund money is for sort of moving dirt, moving contaminants. And we get that. There's a small amount, you probably know, that goes off to the ATSDR and the Centers for Disease Control. We've gotten ATSDR to do studies of each of the 3 sites in town and point out what the problems are. But our problem beyond that is we have all these exposed people who have specific concerns about their health. So we've been very blessed to work with researchers from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University in Atlanta, who are expert on this. We've been doing, and they have been doing, public health screenings in the community for years. When we hold meetings, and we're after COVID, probably gonna have a meeting in May for the public. Every time we schedule a meeting, we get a crowd who come. People are willing to have blood drawn, fill out questionnaires and all this. There's a lot of concern about human health consequences of the exposures. And the stories are, there really are actual consequences, but we don't have any funding coming out of our EPA part of our lives for this. And we really need funding, to support dealing with the human health consequences. We know there, we take our site just for a moment more. Our site, is expanded over the years. Those of you involved with EPA, with Superfund, know about probably the operable unit concept. And so our initial operable unit, which was the factory grounds, has been expanded. We have an operable unit in our river and an athletic field in the floodplain, and now 30 miles downstream along the floodplain. But the contaminant was spread all over, especially the lower peninsula of Michigan, if you know about our geography on that map on the left. And the darker places are the farms that got most of the contaminants. And so we have contaminants spread far beyond our site. But of course, the operable unit concept for Superfund sites doesn't apply to them. So this contamination isn't on the site, yet we have very real human health concerns about what's happened to the people who are in those various parts of the state. And now many of them have kids, grandkids who have moved out of Michigan. And we do know there's intergenerational, at least, passage of some of the contaminant to future generations, possibly with health consequences. So what are we going to do about that? We know there's one precedent in Libby, Montana, where Superfund funds were actually used to open a health clinic to help people exposed to fibers from a mine run by W.R. Grace. And, we're glad that happened for the people in Libby, but in some ways, many of our sites, certainly ours, needs more money for human health work. And this is not just theoretical research. This is actually clinical responses to people who have a health problem as a result of exposures. What we probably need is not one health clinic. We needed that 40 years ago. What we probably need now is support for our public health programs around the state, support for Emory, so they don't have to try to get money out of other sources at CDC. There should be automatic funding, we would hope, that goes to Superfund sites that have demonstrated human health outcomes.
Thank you so much, Ed, for speaking. I'm going to share my screen now. Again, so we'll move on. The tech is not my strong suit. Right. So next we have Marcus Griswold, founder and director of Calm Waters Group. Marcus has 15 years of experience as a scientist, planner, and policy analyst working on watershed assessment and restoration, climate change, contaminated sites, environmental justice, and community engagement. He works on and provides mediation, facilitation, and planning services to nonprofits, local, state, and federal governments and tribes. He believes that communities already know what is needed to solve climate justice and helps them tell their story, advocate for their needs, and engage with agencies. Through his personal family experiences, he has deep connections with the disability community in San Francisco Bay and enjoys camping, kayaking, and hiking with his family. I'll pass it over to you, Marcus. Thank you.
Thanks, Jillian. And yeah, just humbled to be here with everyone else who's a panelist. Just wanted to kind of dive into the community perspective and just think about this whole idea of what Jillian mentioned of the $4.5 billion coming into a Superfund program. And I'm going to come at it from the perspective of what Jillian just mentioned of the community knows what is needed along the lines of what Ed mentioned. And how is this transferred to the EPA, to the PRPs, to the people trying to clean up the site? And we can move to the next slide. So I've ended up working with over a dozen communities dealing with contamination. providing the assistance of, understanding like what the policies are saying, what the thousands of pages of documents that you all are familiar seeing, what they say. And then also kind of trying to bring the best practices from other sites up to the community and up to EPA and the corporations that have caused the pollution. And in those communications, we've really heard that there's a need for sharing amongst organizations around, understanding the science, understanding the policy, kind of trying to keep on the bleeding edge of what's going on. A real need for the community-driven planning. So some sites that's happened really well with collaborative efforts. Some sites have community advisory groups, and then hundreds of sites don't have any of that support, it seems, from our initial assessment. So there seems to be this opportunity that's emerging for peer sharing of those best practices. How do we accelerate, how can we accelerate actual community engaged cleanup processes for 1,300 sites without a peer sharing network? And some of the work I did previously was under EPA's Technical Assistance Services for Communities program, which helps to do that on a site-by-site level. But there's no way of actual connecting those resources together. And every day there's hundreds of documents coming out from different Superfund sites, hundreds of papers published in peer review articles, and then community plans that are developed at the community level. How do we integrate all these pieces together? And then lastly, there's like the actual science. So EPA has a number of ways of looking at the science. One is through IRIS, which is the Integrated Risk Information System. And that's basically where the agency and external scientists are looking at each of the thousands of chemicals that are out there and figuring out, is EPA, using the best practices around, what are the impacts on health? What are the impacts on the environment? But largely the process of IRIS is that it takes, years to decades to go through the process of reviewing a new chemical or reviewing an existing chemical's impacts to the health and the environment. And then it also then takes years to actually get into the hands of the Superfund program managers that are implementing that. So for instance, at the Portland Harbour Superfund site, PCBs are a big issue. PCBs are currently going under review at EPA under the IRIS system, yet that process is going to take forever to get actually down to the cleanup process. And many sites are actually just never going to see those thresholds come into play because of how long it takes. Another opportunity is, state agencies and universities and local agencies also develop their own thresholds for contamination. Sometimes they're stronger and more aggressive than EPA's, but often those agencies are then kind of pushing against both the responsible parties and EPA to really implement those stronger solutions. So how do we kind of make sure that the best science and the best practices are used? Next. So when we are looking at community engagement, I'm pulling this from the Facilitated Power Network, but also this comes from larger kind of processes. I'm thinking about how do we move from community engagement and information to actual community-driven power shift. So, I think Cassie mentioned, the idea of largely the communities that are working around or living around Superfund sites are faced with a pretty hefty David and Goliath issue of fighting uphill with corporations that are multi-global in many cases. And often, the EPA community involvement coordinators are doing a great job to try to, help the communities and try to give information, but that's just one person. So how can we kind of shift away from like just giving information and consulting to actually deferring to, when we start the Superfund process, how do we know what the community's needs are? How do we start out the process of thinking about what the uses are of the site? Like, what is the community vision this contaminated parcel being converted to? So how do we, shift that ownership? That's a really important question. Next. And I think, our proposition is that, that can be done with a network. There are a number of science and technical networks out there. So the National Institute of Health has a Superfund research program. They do have an engagement part of that. but they're very focused on a specific chemical or a specific research question that they're asking for each of those research programs that are hosted at universities. The Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, or ITRC, is a familiar face for many of the consultants that are working on the sites, as well as EPA and state agencies, but it's not really user-friendly for community organizations. It's really about getting that technical information to the people doing the cleanup. Same with ClueIn, which is a network of kind of sharing network around what remediation strategies are working. But there are a number of community-based coalitions that are really working at the community level, like Ed and Cassie mentioned, that are looking at either the state level or the city or the regional level. But I'm not currently familiar with one that's really looking at the national level of how do we connect communities together. What is this community doing? And what is EPA doing at this site to address PCBs or PFAS, which is a current hot topic? And how can we share the practices that are going on at each site with others? So I just kind of continue to advocate for that. That would be a great use of funds for EPA and others to consider slicing part of that money apart to really bring together a network of organizations to share those best practices. Next. So I just want to leave with the kind of these questions, and I think hoping to really think about how do we answer these questions when we think about allocating the $4.5 billion. Thinking about, are there ways that best practices are being shared now between communities, or even between EPA project managers? Are they talking to each other about what's working at which sites and what's not working at which sites? How are communities in the same community, state, or region collaborating? We shared a little bit of some networks that are out there, but there are probably many more that I'm not familiar with. And then there's a lot of new executive orders and regulations coming out from EPA around climate change mitigation and adaptation, around environmental justice and outreach. And we're just not sure how they're reaching down to the site level or even the regional level at this point. It's not quite clear that there is a strategic framework and process for doing that. But at the end of the day, the question is really, how do we accelerate collaboration? But how do we accelerate, spending that $4.5 billion in a wise way? That's, at the end of the day, the communities are living at these sites, not the contractors, not EPA. So how do we make sure the sites are developed and redeveloped and cleaned up in a way that reflects the community needs and best practices? So just, I want to thank everyone for their time, and I'd love to continue to have this conversation another time.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Next up, we have Jim Wolford. Jim boasts a 34-year career with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency from 2006 until his retirement in April of 2020. Jim was the director of the Office of Superfund Remediation and Technology Innovation in EPA's Office of Land and Emergency Management. Since leaving the EPA, Jim has been volunteering with the Environmental Protection Network, continuing to provide high-level analysis and recommendations for proposed EPA budgets and appropriation bills, rulemakings, and other activities. He also provides extensive pro bono support to under-resourced communities, NGOs, and state, local, and tribal agencies through the Environmental Protection Network's Capacity Building Technical Assistance Program. I'm going to be asking Jim a few questions about the Superfund program, starting with how have delays over the past 25 years, in particular since the polluter pays taxes lapsed, harmed communities? And Jim, you are muted also.
Okay, there we go. All right, sorry about that. And first of all, before I answer the question, I actually want to thank the U.S. PERG for its efforts to get the polluter pays tax reinstated. I think it will play a major role in helping to sort of reestablish the footing of the program and moving away from the reliance on general revenues, which I think ultimately will which will benefit communities. And Congressman Blumenauer for his support year in, year out of trying to reinstate the tax and, and finally getting there. I think it's all very important, to do. And so, the program, and so to answer the first question, the program, the Superfund program, and I was the director for 14 years in the headquarters National Program Office. And Ed, you and Marcus, I'd be glad to talk to you and my guys as EPN. I have lots of thoughts about things you said and maybe some things that could be useful for you. And so myself or other participants, we got 5 or 6 really, really good people in the environmental protection networks that are Superfund, worked in Superfund regional offices, were remedial project managers. I think we'd be happy to talk with you. But Julian is in talking about this has sort of let off. So what's been the impact? I'll start with the word delay. Delay has been sort of the watchword of the Superfund program since about 2000. And one of the things that the lack of funding did, and the most obvious is obviously starting construction projects. And that's the one thing people focus on, is the one very visible aspect of the program. And Ed, I know your site very well, because your site was one of the sites that wasn't funded. And we would get in requests from the Michigan delegation that said, could you please fund the sites? And the agency had this very elaborate process where it goes through and evaluates the sites that need funding for construction. And for 3 or 4 years, I think the Velzacol site did not get funded because it did not score high enough in our criteria. Eventually it did. And so, but with the infrastructure funding, the agency, I think Julian mentioned all the sites that are getting funding, is able to go out and fund that work. So that's the most visible thing. And so it's sort of like there have been delays in rectifying the problems that have impacted these communities. So yes, human health and environmental impact in those communities has been affected, but the funding shortages were across the profile of the agency. Everything from our initial assessment of sites and the preliminary assessment, site investigation, and putting sites on the national priorities list. That part, when you don't have enough money to go around, you sort of skim off a little here and there. So we didn't fund that as much as could be done. For the parts, when sites get listed, the RIFS process, which many of you are familiar with, that too was not funded at an optimal level. And what that does is it stretches out the work over time. And so it means it doesn't happen as quickly as it should. You could go back and look at the Superfund data, as I did as sitting in the National Program Director, and look at the duration of the various phases of the program. And you could see that over time, they just keep getting longer and longer and longer. Whether you're talking about remedial investigation, feasibility study, design, whether you're talking about construction projects, delays, or even the actual construction, because many sites, even once they got money for doing the work, they were not funded fully for the work that could be done in any given year. So there were delays that happened there. And then, post cleanup, a lot of the water treatment systems, the agency deferred maintenance, deferred upgrades, and, the plants were, operating, but they weren't operating at the most optimal, efficient level. So across the board, the lack of funding impacted what the program was able to do, and therefore impacted the affected communities, the underserved communities in particular, adversely affected those. We just could not deliver things in this timely manner as we should in the program. One of the things that I do think, and some of you have touched on this a little bit, but I think the Congress and the agency needs to look at is the public participation aspect of Superfund in Section 117. That was put in place now almost 40 years ago, and it limited the fund to providing technical assistance grants to the agency. to $50,000 a year. That's $1984. It hasn't changed in almost 40 years. And so if you take into account inflation, the value of that $50,000, which is for the lifetime, and the agency has processes where it can waive it, but it's not easy, is basically now worth about $25,000. So I think that's an area that, the Hill may want to look at. I think community groups may want to look at, and and just go back and revisit it, because the agency has struggled to sort of work around aspects of that, like in terms of providing technical assistance to communities and coming up with a task program, which has been mentioned. So I think that deserves a look-see. And right now, I think when I left 2 years ago now, I think only 300 communities get tag grants out of the 1,300 that are currently, active on the MPL. So I think there's an opportunity there that's being missed. And so, Marcus, you mentioned, bringing together communities and coalitions, and that's difficult given the diverse nature of communities and problem-facing individuals. But I don't think the agency's doing enough, in my opinion, to help make that happen. The agency can, and it happens in the redevelopment. They can do visioning, they can do other things, but there's not direct statutory authority to do things like that. Maybe that's something the agency and perhaps some of the with the leadership of the community groups could help help make happen. But I think that the reinstatement of the tax will go a long way to addressing a lot of the needs of the impacted communities with in Superfund.
Thank you, Jim. That's great. A lot of really good information there. My next question is, how should the EPA, what should the EPA do with this anticipated influx of funds to better support communities and to remediate Superfund sites?
Well, first of all, the most obvious things, and this happened, people will remember the American Reinvestment Recovery Act back in 2009. The agency back at that point in time had a backlog of sites of like 25, 26 unfunded sites, and we funded those with the $575 million we got then. So obviously the agency's getting a lot more, I think, as Bill Muno pointed out in the chat. Obviously addressing those sites, making sure the sites get optimal funding. There are many sites out there. When we were, one of the, I think, little known facts that we had to do is we basically capped what we could spend in any given year on any given site, any given operable unit. So even a site that had a public health emergency, like Libby, Montana, before we got the W.R. Grace settlement, we were funding at $15 million a year. That was the maximum we felt we could provide that site and fund under sites around the country. So we were spreading the money very, very thinly around the country. And there are sites where we're doing sediment cleanup. New Bedford Harbour was one where very well documented by the region. We would fund them at $15 million a year as well. And before we got a settlement there with the responsible parties to help pay for the work, that $15 million a year would basically fund for 2 months of dredging. So that's the kind of impacts that you see. And once we got the settlement there, we were able to almost triple the funding, 2.5 times more than what we were funding. And dredging went from 2 months to 6 months and accelerated the cleanup and probably ended up saving us 25-30% overall in just terms of total site costs. So definitely funding the sites that haven't been funded adequately, addressing the backlog, funding the sites that that are still in the study stage, try to reduce the duration of those projects, get to decisions faster. And I think they should use the money as leverage against responsible parties. One of the other things that happened with the tight funding we had is EPA would enter into negotiations with responsible parties that would take sometimes years. We had hoped when we created the program way back when, that phase of the program from getting a decision to starting a design would take anywhere from 6 to 9 months. And if you couldn't do it then you would use money out of the trust fund and the agency would then start to work. What happened is when you don't have enough funds, those negotiations just continue and continue and continue on, sometimes for years with nothing really happening at the site. And so the agency now has the leverage, I think, that it can say to a responsible party, look, we've talked with you 6 months. You either sign the order or we start doing the work. That is something that's a tool in the toolbox that I think becomes a huge inducement for responsible parties to then settle with the EPA and do the work. But the agency has to be willing to do that. The other thing, and I think it's been alluded to as well, there are about 80% of the cleanups that have been completed to date have left waste in place. So they require 5-year reviews. So I know Ed talked about the caps at Felsenthal, for example. There's waste buried under those caps, right? The agency needs to go back, and I think with an eye toward climate change, and relook at those remedies and see if there's a case to be made for doing more extensive cleanups and take those out of the environment altogether. And that's a way they could use the infrastructure money, and that would extend, first of all, I think it would help with reuse and redevelopment of facilities. Personal opinion, would provide much greater certainties for the waste. Take it out of the community, take it out of the ecosystem. It provides many more assurances to the people in the community. Hey, it's now safer. You don't have to worry about a flood, a tornado, sea level rise, a wildfire. I think the agency needs to relook at those sites. And I know there have been congressional studies and other things that have thrown out, some of these monies. We think these sites are, we meaning the agency, think these sites currently are safe for the most part. It doesn't mean we can't do more. And if there's a case to be made that there are vulnerabilities there are site vulnerabilities, then I think the agency should look at perhaps reopening some of the remedies, not all the remedies, but some of the remedies, and moving and doing a much more thorough cleanup at those sites. So those are a few things the agency could do with those funds. I'd say even with those funds right now, there's more than enough work to be done that those funds could be used up very quickly. Mining sites are inordinately expensive. Sediment sites where you don't have PRPs are very expensive as well. And those funds could be used up very, very quickly. It seems like, I know $4 billion is a lot of money, but if I were still in the agency, I would have a plan right now for how to spend the $4 billion, and it would probably be all used up within the next 5 years. I mean, it's not that hard to do, and and the agency could reach out and work, as been suggested, with NIEHS and the Superfund Research Program and ATSCR and CDC, and look at some of the chemicals that are not on the radar screen right now. The Irish program is extremely slow. I will say that. I agree with whoever raised that point, and see what we can do there in terms of extending and providing more protection to communities. So those are some ideas. NIHS, by the way, Superfund Research Program, gets about $50 million of Superfund dollar, annually, out of the congressional appropriation. So there is money there. Maybe not enough, but there are funds that can be made available. I think that could help those out. That would probably take a congressional appropriation as opposed to the agency just moving the money over because of the way the appropriations process works. But yeah, that could be done as well. So with that, I'll shut up and, and answer your questions. So it's good seeing everybody, and I appreciate being asked to be a part of this.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jim. Those were really, really helpful answers and a lot of good information there. I'm going to open it up for a Q&A section to all the speakers now for some of the questions that have been generated in the chat while everyone has been speaking. And the first question really to whomever wants to say something on PFAS and the new rule inclusion of PFAS as a hazardous chemical under CERCLA. This question is from Mr. Dow about the lack of funding for addressing PFAS at its source and what role Superfund could play in that cleanup. Does anyone have thoughts on that in particular?
So I'll kick off with this because the regulation or the draft regulation that was started in the Trump administration was actually drafted in my office to make PFOA and PFAS hazardous substances under Superfund, and then look at 4 or 5 other of the PFAS chemicals where we had good sort of tox data. It's extremely useful to make it a hazardous substance. First of all, just from the ability to use our emergency response removal authorities, it sort of removes questions around that and the ability to cost recover and take enforcement action. So that's very important. Other federal agencies had said that, and I have my opinions on this, that they really couldn't take any action because EPA had not declared PFOA, PFAS as hazardous substances. So they were kind of stuck in limbo. I think it removes that argument. And if that's an impediment, that impediment. I'm not sure that was a real impediment, but that's one person's opinion. I think the other thing is, and I think I saw a question about this in the chat, having an MCL or MCLG for PFOA, PFAS in groundwater is going to be really critical because that sets the benchmark that we have at the agency can use at a federal level. And I know some states have their own MCLs, but that's sort of the benchmark that the agency could use in selecting groundwater remedies. And having that, many states, there's sort of trickle down effect to on the state side that many states will follow that or adopt a very similar number or for use at the sort of the non-national priorities list sites for the, for them to use. So I think those are all very important things that can happen in the PFAS world. And hopefully the agency can move out and get out the proposed rule, take comment on it, and then finalize that rule in an expedited fashion.
The next question is about working with PRPs, specifically at the Portland Harbour Superfund site. Cassie responded in the chat that there are about 150 PRPs at the site, likely at the site. And the question is, are there examples where PRPs may have too much influence at the site, or what has been the experience of working with these groups compared to working with the EPA or that combination?
Cassie, this is worth an offline conversation. Just in full disclosure, so folks are aware, back when Gina McCarthy was getting confirmed in 2012, the Oregon delegation basically asked, I think at the behest of many parties, that EPA headquarters be more involved at Portland Harbor site and actually select the remedy, sign off on the remedy that was being developed at that time, which ultimately Gina McCarthy signed off on in January 2017. I was, in my role as the National Program Director for the Superfund Remedial Program, I ended up being designated as the headquarters person to work with our Region 10 colleagues out in Seattle, the folks with Oregon DEQ, the community people, the city of Portland, the responsible parties. And so I spent a disproportionate amount of my time, but it's time I very much enjoyed, working on this site. I would say I spent 25% of my time as a national program manager in charge of, in theory, in charge of 1,300 sites, overseeing 1,300 sites. Spent 20% of my time on this one site, which until we got the remedy. So obviously working with responsible parties. And the parties, try to use their influence on the political process, both before, actually during the Obama administration and in the Trump administration on both sides. It was, I think, much more prevalent in the Trump administration. We did issue an explanation of significant difference and change a cleanup level, but that was based on about the Irish process, a change in toxicity for one particular contaminant that was driven by the science, and that was a very targeted change. That was actually something that I oversaw in my guise as the national program manager, and got that, and people fall on either side of that, but I felt it was something that needed to be done for many different reasons. But responsible parties, 150 are a lot to deal with. I think the agency, and there are many reasons why what's happening there. But there's a mixture of local businesses, national firms, multinational firms, which really make this site very difficult to handle. There are 12 distinct areas, I think maybe 11, that require work to be done, more design work to be done. And the parties are proceeding along. Yes, they're, and the agency has to work with them all because, it's $1 billion remedy, which takes a lot of time and effort. That's about as in depth as I can go on this without getting into too much detail and getting the matters that are probably confidential on the side of the agency, and in the workings that has happened there. But to date, there's been the one small change based on the change in toxicity at that site since we signed the remedy in 2017. And as far as I know, all the work is proceeding on design across the river. I don't know in particular, Cassie, you raised a question, I think, about sampling in the areas where EPA is doing the lead, because it has money to do it, actually. I don't know enough details about that to comment on that, but obviously it needs a pretty robust sampling regime in order to produce a good remedial design to do the cleanup there at Cathedral Park.
Cassie or Mammalia, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I know there's a lot of other questions as well, so I don't know, unless also Mark has had you're kind of the technical advisor on Cathedral Park as well, or Portland Harbor, so I don't know if you wanted to add any critical point on sampling or.
Well, actually, I want to step back to Jim's point really quick. I think, one thing that we've struggled with at not just this site, but other sites is, the openness, right? So this is the power piece, right? That the PRPs and EPA are in the same room all the time, as well as their contractors. Yet it's very hard to get in those conversations as a community member. And when those are opened up, there's a lot of hesitance by the PRPs to actually be open and candid in conversations. And then when we kind of push them a little harder, there's a lot of defensiveness from the community perspective. So it's just, that could be something that EPA could certainly facilitate, whether it has to be legislation programmatically or just training, staff training, like for how to be more open, and kind of be balanced with stakeholders. How do you view the PRPs as an equal weighting with the community or less than an equal weighting, depending on what your views are? So it's just a simple, I think, a question that could really help the work.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's often no legal leverage that EPA has to be able to mandate that the PRPs do more than the minimum, especially around community engagement or, for example, Superfund jobs training. You know, it was sort of, you know, like our Region 10 was able to, you know, put into our community involvement plan just that, you know, there was a requirement that PRPs engage in dialogue with EPA about the Superfund jobs training program. However, there is no requirement that they actually pursue the Superfund jobs training program. So, you know, how many dialogues have there been to date? You know, I mean, it's been totally one-sided. EPA's put feelers out and no PRPs have responded. There's been, I think, 1 out of 150 parties that have said, oh, you know, we're kind of interested, but they're also one of the parties that have historically been, you know, one of the worst performing parties, you know, one of the parties that has not been supportive of stepping up and participating in cleanup. So
have you had any non-Superfund like legal challenges to, say, dumping from any of these? Because we had success in getting the Justice Department, which was suing one of our big polluters, into working out it was called a supplemental environmental project as a resolution to the fines they were going to impose, and we actually got the money spent locally rather than it going into the Treasury. I don't know whether you have anybody who's in that position.
Well, I know there is a pending settlement with Monsanto that are across multiple sites and states, and you know, so the Portland Harbour kind of falls within that large settlement, and we have really no idea yet kind of how that'll play out, where, you know, if there's funding, where it will lie and who it will benefit, and so there's lots of unknowns.
Well, our settlement was with a major refiner, and they had already reached agreement apparently, but we interceded and were successful in getting them to convert what they were going to pay into for clean air. It was a Clean Air Act violation, and you know, got millions for a supplemental environmental project.
So before you go down that rabbit hole too far, the status of supplemental environmental project SEPs has been questioned, at least it was in the Trump administration, by the Justice Department. And I don't know if it's still viable. I just haven't followed that recently. I'd have to check with my enforcement colleagues and see if it's still a viable option out there. You know, one of the challenges in the Superfund job training initiative, which is actually operated out of my old office I used to head, it's one of those things, Cassie, that we ask parties, our PRPs, to participate in. There's nothing statutorily we have that actually creates that program. We did it to sort of parallel what was going on in brownfields, and thought it was a good idea. And we went out and we did it, and we got, you know, some sites with more cooperative PRPs to step up and do the work. And so we would do the training, pay for the training out of headquarters dollars to do that. Again, something the agency could do. You know, but I think what the agency, you know, could possibly do, and there are a number of brownfield sites in Portland Harbor, but also in other communities as well. I think the agency needs to relook at how the Superfund program can intersect better with the brownfield grants program and sort of leverage the job trainings that happen on both sides of the ledger to help out communities that are impacted. And I've mentioned that to some folks inside the agency as well. But, you know, there is a possibility that you could leverage the brownfield grants dollars along with the Superfund JTI dollars with work that's needed to be done, get a holistic view of what a community needs. And so you're not just doing all the projects as one-offs, and they're not coordinated, they're not aligned. And that's something the agency could probably, I will say, the agency can do a much better job at. There's just, I think there's too much stovepiping of the various programs, and you could look at that. And I think the agency could do a better job, you know, serving communities as well, and, you know, bring in other agencies like HHS and NIEHS and Department of Labor and others to sort of do a holistic assessment of what does a community need, I mean, in addition to cleaning up the Superfund site, and see if there's ways that we can leverage the federal funds that we do have, and I mean we meaning the country and all the agencies, to basically help out the communities that have been impacted by the Superfund sites and other things that are going on in their communities. One person's opinion. This is not an official agency viewpoint.
We have time for one more question, and this is a follow-up from Ed's presentation, noting that there's a gap in funding for cleanup between funding for health research and funding for cleanup. How can we utilize what we've learned on health effects to improve the health of communities exposed?
I mean, I'll just go back. Go ahead.
Please.
Oh, go.
Well, I guess I'm just going to like shift back into the network idea. Like, how do we share the best practices, right? Like, so if we have an ASTDR study for lead in Pueblo, and we have an ASTDR study for PFAS in another area, like, how are we actually communicating these back up the chain and then back out of the chain into the community? And it just doesn't seem like that's happening. I'm sure, you know, Jim's mention of $50 million to NIH kind of programs does seem kind of low as well, because every community that I've worked in is really asking for a better health impact study, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone like to add anything to that before we wrap up?
Well, I think it is a challenge of sort of the silos that are inevitable, you know. I think, but they also we need to consciously think ways of linking them, not just letting them, you know, I mean, I understand EPA's perspective. I think EPA is into cleaning up contaminants and not, you know, they haven't been charged, despite what the mission statement I think says about human health. They've been told, well, you got to deal with the actual human health consequences of this. It's protecting us from what we know are exposure risks by cleaning up what is exposing us. But that's a silo. You know, life is not just in that silo, and it's not EPA's fault. It's how do we bridge the gap between the human being who lived across the street from the Superfund site, who has a, you know, thyroid problem that almost certainly relates to the exposure because the product caused thyroid problems, just using it as a theoretical example. So, you know, how do we bridge that gap? Who deals with that? It's not really EPA's responsibility while they're cleaning up to be providing treatment for that person, but who does?
Mm-hmm. I agree. And then I also really appreciated the point that Jim brought up around how sites, you know, kind of I think it was you, Jim, about how, you know, the overall kind of the standards for remedies of Superfund sites should we should see some shifting happening on a national level so that communities are being protected more, that institutional controls that require these long-term caps that are subject to exposure in, you know, the climate storms and etc. are just not solutions. And, you know, communities see through that all the time and are up against just enormous barriers to make any sort of meaningful changes to see the types of, and the levels of cleanup that they want to see. And so then, long-term risks to health are always there in perpetuity. So it's, yes, health is kind of number one priority here, and it needs to be elevated more in Superfund.
Absolutely.
I think if I could throw out one other idea, this is my ideas day, I think. Years ago, early on in my tenure as director, Superfund used to hold a standalone national community involvement coordinators conference, a CIC conference. And as part of that conference, we would actually have a day or two where we would invite tag recipients and members from CAGs to come in and participate in those conferences. We went away from that partly because of the funding issues that we had. And then the agency sort of revamped the whole way it was looking at community involvement to be cross-program, bringing in other media, air, water, et cetera, which is, I think, is a good thing. I think, something from the community side of the ledger is, but what that tended to do was dilute because no one was in charge then. It's sort of, one year was the air office, next year was the water office, and it was back to the Superfund office, and then it went somewhere else. And then it was, someone who couldn't do it, or they didn't, the enforcement office, they didn't have resources to do it. I think the time is ripe, and I don't even know who does it because there isn't one place people could go. And Superfund ended up doing a lot of heavy lifting for those conferences, quite honestly. Not that the other offices didn't contribute or didn't do work, but we did a lot of work. Because Superfund, being very place-based, being very community-based, did it. I think the agency needs to go back and relook at that and revive that if it can. So Marcus, you brought up, how can you bring collaboration? One is you got to get people together, maybe even get them in the same room. And you can't get everyone from across the country, but just restart that process where you can help bring those together. And you ask how you could spend the $3 billion of infrastructure money. That could be use of those funds. And it's a lot of effort to put those conferences together. I don't discount that at all, having been the lead of that for many of those, in my office being the lead, and finding a venue and getting the people there and getting them invited and making sure you get the right people. But that's the kind of thing that's needed. And I think the mindset of the agency is right now would be pretty receptive to doing something like that. You just need, like the Office of Public Affairs or something like that, somebody to stand up and take the lead on doing something like that, just to get the folks together, to start that dialogue and sharing of the ideas. And I will say, from where I said as a national program manager, those very rewarding for me, because you would be interacting. It's interacting with your colleagues is great and wonderful, and I really miss it. But you get to interact with the people that are impacted by the work that you do. And that, to me, I just took so much away from that in terms of energy from what you do. And hey, what you're doing makes a difference. And as a public service, a lot of times you don't see what you do makes a difference. You theoretically understand that. And you understand that people are maybe not going to be happy with you and be critical of you, but that goes with the territory. I just think, the agency needs to relook at that and perhaps, stand up, or they could do it in different parts of the country. They could do 4 of these. They could do one on the East Coast, one in the North Central, one in the South Central, one in the West Coast. They could do stuff like that. But there's things like that the agency can do to help bring people together and start sharing of ideas and building those networks that are needed.
Yeah, they were really helpful meetings. They were the ones we went to.
Yeah. So with that, I'll shut up, Julian, and probably giving you more than enough work to do. And there are things to think about.
That's great. And I think that's something that is so important that we're all engaged in moving forward. I want to thank everyone so much for coming. Thank the presenters so much for being here and sharing your information and your time. It really was great. We'll be sending out to all the attendees contact information and can answer any questions after the fact. Also, thank you to Environmental Protection Network, fantastic organization who's co-hosting this event with us. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you.